reason that we are doing today's class is because we need a little bit of introduction into microeconomics, market theory before we move on. We may not be using all of this in tomorrow's class, or we may not be using all of this in the next two classes, but eventually for the remaining classes during this semester, we will be specifically focusing on this part. So, the economics will be based on whatever we are doing now. It will not be as explicit as this class, because you know every time when we do the theory part, it is more explicit and very specific, but then when we use it in terms of healthcare, we only use the bits and pieces from there and apply it to the healthcare field. So, the same thing we are going to do here. So, this class is about market theory. So, you have done so far demand theory, we have also spent some time on production and cost theory. Now, this is about market theory. So, demand theory is specifically about the consumers and the producers, that is their buying behavior and their selling behavior. What would a buyer want to buy and what price is he willing to pay? How much is a seller willing to sell and what price is he willing to accept, right? Production and cost theory is totally from the perspective of the seller or the producer, and it is not looking at his selling behavior, rather it is looking at his producing behavior, because a seller has a twofold job. He sells in the market, but before he sells, he also needs to produce, and when he produces, then he also has a cost of production, because he cannot produce out of thin air. Right. So, that is what we saw in the production and cost theory. Now, the next theory that we have is the market theory. Now, in this market theory, we are basically bringing that producer and the consumer together, and we are looking at their behavior simultaneously. Okay. Now, you may say, then what is the difference between that demand curve and the supply curve and that cross diagram that we had, because that was also the market diagram, right? That market diagram was for a specific market. So, we said, okay, this is the market for health insurance, or this is the market for apples, or this is the market for organs, and this is the buying behavior and this is the selling behavior of the buyer and the seller in that market, right? But here we are going one level deeper and saying what is the structure of that market. So, this is a theory of that institution where the buyers and the sellers are coming and interacting with each other. So, in some sense you can call this an industry rather than a market, you can call it an industry. For example, if you had multiple sellers of apples in this market, then this is a theory that applies to all those sellers in general. Okay. If you had a market for hospitals, then this is a theory that applies to that entire hospital industry. If you have a market for pharmaceuticals, this is a theory that applies to all the pharmaceutical companies. So, this is, in other words, this is like an industry study. It is the theory of an industry study. Okay. So, any industry study or any market study depends on three things, that is the structure, the conduct, and finally the performance. So, we look at these three things in any market or industry study. What is the structure? Structure is just the structure of the market. Okay. How is the market set up? What is the cost? What is the behavior of the buyers? What is the behavior of the sellers in this market? So, we look at it. So, this is something like looking at an overview, okay, as if you were taking an overview of the market. Okay. Then you have the conduct. When it comes to conduct, it specifically talks about how are the buyers and the sellers conducting themselves in this market. Okay. How do they, in other words, how do they operate in the market? And finally, you have, based on this structure and this conduct, what is the performance of the market overall. So, these are the three most important pillars in any market theory. Now, there are four types of markets that we study in economics. Here, four primary type of markets. There may be other markets also, but here for this class, we are just going to cover three types of markets. The first market is called perfect competition. Okay. As the very name suggests, this is the most perfect kind of market. By perfect, I mean this is the most efficient market. Efficient market. Okay. But having said that, this is also a hypothetical case. That means in the real world, it is very difficult to find a market or find an industry that is exactly a perfect competition. Okay. It is a hypothetical market, but it is also the most efficient market. Then the next question is, if it is hypothetical, if it does not exist in the real world, then why do we have to study a theory of this market? The reason being that since it is the most perfect one, since it is the most efficient one, this serves as the benchmark. This serves as a reference. So, every other market is some kind of deviation around perfect competition. Every other market. Okay. That is why the perfectly competitive market acts as a reference or a yardstick for evaluating other market structures. The second market structure is a monopoly, and the third market structure is monopolistic competition. Okay. Now, as far as your healthcare is concerned, your field is concerned, you are mostly concerned with three kinds of markets in the real world. One market which deals with pharmaceuticals, pharma products, drugs. The second market which deals with the healthcare workforce, that is the market for physicians and nurses. And then there is a market for the hospitals and long-term care hospices, nursing homes, right. So, those are the three different kinds of markets that you can have in the healthcare field. And here we are not considering health insurance and all of that, because we have treated health insurance separately. Okay. Now, all those markets that you have in your field, that is hospital market, physicians and nurses market, and also the pharmaceuticals market, they basically fall under this market theory, the monopolistic competition. Okay. Then the next question is, why are we not studying just monopolistic competition? The reason being, like I told you, if we have to study monopolistic competition and we need to evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of monopolistic competition, then we must compare it with the most perfect one, that is the perfect competition. And secondly, we are studying monopoly because there is a tendency in this industry to change into a monopoly. So, any operator or any firm within the monopolistic competitive industry tries to become a monopoly and gain some advantages out of it. That is why we are also going to know a little bit about monopoly. Okay? So, this chapter, obviously there will be graphs, but these graphs are not the demand and supply graphs, but these are going to be your cost and your revenue graphs that we have covered about couple of classes back, right, the production and cost theory. Okay. In perfect competition, so we measure, we have the two-dimensional graph. Okay, once again back to the graphs. Where you measure output on the x-axis, and output is either denoted by y or it is denoted by q, whichever. Okay. I am just calling it q, let us say, you can call it y. So, basically how much is produced. Okay. The second one, here we measure everything else, that is we measure revenue, we measure the total cost, so the average total cost, and we also measure the marginal cost. So, any cost, revenue, profit, everything goes on the y-axis. On the x-axis you have just the quantity. Everything else is measured on the y-axis. Okay. Is that clear? Now, if you remember, then we had that ATC curve which we talked about, right, which is first like a U shape, which is first downward falling and then it is upward rising. So, the ATC curve looks like that, remember. Here it is the spreading out effect which is dominant, right. There the diminishing returns effect that is dominant, and hence this curve has a U shape. And we said that the marginal cost curve cuts through this place, right. This is where the marginal cost curve cuts through, and then you have let us draw the marginal cost curve also. And that is basically, this point will be the minimum point of ATC, right. That is where the marginal cost curve is going to cut. So, if we call this point A is basically the minimum point of ATC. Okay. Now, let us first talk about what are the features of perfect competition. What does a perfectly competitive market look like, and why are we saying that this is a hypothetical market? So, a perfectly competitive market, first of all, it has infinite number of buyers and sellers. That itself is an unrealistic thing to happen in the real world, because no matter which market it is, there will be a finite number of people who want to buy and a finite number of people who want to sell, right. But this is a market where you cannot count the number of buyers and sellers, uncountable, extremely infinitely large number of buyers and sellers, and hence it is, there is so much of competition between them, between the buyers and the sellers. There is perfect setting of competition because they are infinitely large in number. The second feature of this market is all sellers sell an identical or homogeneous product. So, that means there is no difference whatsoever, not even a hair difference in the product that each seller is selling. That is also very unrealistic, because in the real world, even if a seller has two different products which are, physically they may look the same, there will be some difference based on the, at least the brand, right. The brand of person A may not be the same as the brand of person B, or the color of the product will not be the same. There will be some minute difference, right. It is not possible that the product sold by all sellers, especially when you have infinitely large number of sellers, will be exactly the same, exactly the mirror images of each other, right. But what follows from here is that since they are all selling an identical product, what do you think should be the price of that product? Should it be different prices, or should it be the same price? It should be the same price, because if any other seller is selling it for a higher price, then the buyers always have the option of not buying from him, but rather buying from somebody who is offering it at a lower price, right. So, even if you try to sell your product for a higher price, you cannot sell it, because it is exactly the same as what she is selling or what he is selling. So, I have the option as a buyer to go to somebody who is offering that product to me for a cheaper price. So, what follows from this is that there is a single price in the market. There is a single price in the market, and all sellers and all buyers face that same price. Okay, is that clear why it is so? Right. So, the next follows from this, all sellers are price takers. What does that mean? Usually in any market, you see it is the seller who kind of decides on the price. I want a good, I walk into your store, you tell me what is the price that you want to sell it for, and then if I am okay with that price, I decide to buy your good. If I am not okay with that price, I walk out and I go to another store where I might find it for cheaper, or I buy a substitute good, or I try to bargain with you for a lower price. That is how it works in any market. But in this market, sellers basically have no power, because if you are not going to sell your good to me, there is a very next person who is selling exactly the same good, maybe for a lower price, so I will buy from that person. So, you are left with no other option but to sell it to me at the price that she is selling. Similarly for somebody else, right. And if somebody wants to undercut, if there is one person who wants to sell it at lower price, then everybody else has to follow that same price, because otherwise all buyers will rush to that seller who is selling it for cheaper. So, the sellers are basically powerless in this market. They do not have any power to decide on the price, and hence they are all price takers. They have to take the price in the market that is prevailing in the market. So, can we say that they are price takers and there is a single price in the market? There is a fixed single price prevailing in the market. Okay? That is the next point. And the last and the final point is that there is free entry, or exit from the market. That is also a very unrealistic thing to happen in the real world, because you know that if you think about a business, to start a business there are some cost involved. Tomorrow morning if I think I am going to start a business, I cannot do it, right? There are some establishment costs of a business. I must first decide what to sell, what to produce, whom to produce it for, what will be my customer base, what are the things I need, how many workers, how many capital. So, there is some cost involved in starting a business. Similarly, if I have been running a business for 1 year, tomorrow morning I cannot wake up and say that, okay, from today my business is shut down. There is also a process, there are also costs involved in shutting down a business. I must incur some loss, and then I should think that, okay, I cannot sustain this loss anymore, and then finally I should decide to shut down. So, usually in an industry in the real world, in a market in the real world, there are barriers to entry or exit. There are obstacles, right, in the form of some kind of cost. But in this market, we are saying that any buyer can walk into the market, any seller can walk into the market. Tomorrow, any seller can leave the market, any buyer can leave the market. There is perfectly no obstacles from entering or leaving the market, but that is not how it works in the real world. So, based on these features, we call perfect competition the most hypothetical market structure, but we still have to study about perfect competition because it is the most perfect one, and all other market structures are deviations from perfect competition. Is that clear? Okay. Okay. Now, before we go back to that diagram, just reminding you that we had total revenue was equal to price times quantity, isn't it? All of you remember? Total revenue is my total earnings from my business, and the total earnings from my business depends on the total amount I produce, that is capital Q, times the price that I get, isn't it? Correct? Now, this price in case of perfect competition is a fixed price, like we just said. This is one single fixed price that all sellers are facing in perfect competition. Will all of you agree to that? Now, marginal revenue, by definition we said that this is the change in total revenue for 1 unit change in production. So, if I raise my production by 1 unit, by how much will my total earnings change? That is marginal revenue. Is everyone clear about that? So, if I produce 100 shirts and I make an income of $100, tomorrow if I produce 101 shirts and I make $110, then my marginal revenue from that 101st shirt is that extra $10, right? That is the concept of marginal revenue. So, in this case, please note that if you are selling 100 shirts, you are selling those 100 shirts for that same price, right, $10, correct? Do you agree? So, for 100 shirts, you will make 100 times 10, that is 1000, which is your total revenue. Now, if you make 101 shirt, that extra 1 shirt will also be selling for $10 in the market according to perfect competition. So, what is the addition to your income? It is that same $10. So, your marginal revenue is nothing but that fixed price, and for every unit that is going to be the same. Do you agree? So, that means basically the law of diminishing marginal revenue does not hold here. Here the marginal revenue will be a fixed number. No matter how many shirts, how many extra shirts you produce, 101, 10, the 102nd one, it will be the extra one, 103rd one, it will be that extra $10. So every time you produce one and one additional shirt, the addition to your income is that fixed price, $10. Do you agree, all of you? Yes? So that means here the marginal revenue, instead of being downward sloping, what should be the slope? What should be the shape of marginal revenue? Matt? Horizontal. It's a constant fixed number, and that number can be anywhere, right, based on where the price level is, correct? It could be here, it could be there, it could be there, depending on whatever the price level is, whatever that number is, correct? But always for that line, this will be the marginal revenue curve, which is a horizontal line. Right? And that marginal revenue will always be equal to the price level. Do you all agree with that? Now let us consider these three different cases that are possible. Now all reminding you, and please keep a note to yourself, that all these three cases are not possible at the same time. Depending on where the price level is in the market, you can have one of those conditions, right? You can have a price level which is higher than the minimum point of ATC, you can have a price level which is lower than the minimum point of ATC, or you can have a price level exactly at the minimum point of ATC, right? All three are not possible at the same time. Let's call those three conditions, let's give three different names to those conditions, right? Let us call this condition 1. So we are just calling it MR1 and P bar 1, calling this MR2 and P bar 2, and calling this MR3 and P bar 3. I want to remind you that all three are not happening at the same time. These are three different possibilities in the market, okay, depending on where that price is in the market. Okay. Now please note, when your production is here, when you have a price level that is here and the minimum cost of production is here, that means you are spending minimum. If you produce at a minimum cost, then you would end up spending so much, right? You are measuring cost here. So if you produce at this minimum cost, your cost of production would be so much, but your price would be at that level. Do you agree? I am considering situation 1. I am just talking about situation 1. If you look at situation 1, your price is P1 bar, but if you are a cost minimizing producer, and we know that all producers try to minimize their cost, right? So if you are a cost minimizing producer, you would be producing at this point, correct? And at that point your cost would be that much, measuring from the vertical axis. So the price that you get in the market is higher than the cost that you spend out of your pocket. So are you going to make a profit there or a loss? All of you understand why it's a profit? Okay. So you can see that no matter where the price level is, as long as it is higher than that minimum point, the seller will be making more money than what he can produce it for, and hence he will be making profit. Is that correct? Now if you are at situation 2, okay, think of second situation, P2 bar, situation 2, then the price that all the sellers are facing is P2 bar, and if they are all cost minimizing producers, which they ought to be because that's an objective of every seller, then the cost of production is also at that level. So he spends exactly the same amount from his pocket as he is able to earn from by selling the good. C is exactly equal to P2 bar. So what is this point? This is 0 profit, 0 loss point. In other words, that is the break even point. Can you please write that down? If the fixed price level if the fixed price level is exactly at the minimum point of ATC, if the fixed price level is exactly at the minimum point of ATC, then the market breaks even, that is 0 profit, 0 loss. Okay. And then obviously you can understand, if the price is at situation 3, that is P3 bar, and they are cost minimizing producers, they still keep producing, but that cost is higher than the price that they can earn in the market. So now they are spending more out of their pocket than what they can earn back from the market, correct? So that means that is a situation of loss. So write down that statement about P3 bar, the same thing. So this is a situation of loss. Now, okay, so 3 things are possible. Breaking even is possible, the industry making profit is possible, the industry making loss is possible, right? Now, if the market is making profit, if an industry is making profit, is that an attractive industry or is it an unattractive industry? It's an attractive industry, right? And please remember, going back to point number 4 here, this is also an industry where anytime sellers can come in. Anytime buyers can come in, anytime sellers can walk out, anytime the buyers can walk out, right? So if this is an attractive industry, do you think new sellers will come into the market? Yes, correct? So when this industry is making profit, there will be new sellers entering. Don't you think so? And new sellers will keep entering till the point all that profit gets wiped out from the market. That means as long as the profit stays in the market, as long as the market continues being attractive, new people will come in, new people will come in, and as more and more and more new people come in, eventually there will be a point when all that profit gets wiped out, right? And the market kind of moves towards this break-even point. Do you agree? Similarly, if it was a situation of loss, then of course it's an unattractive market, and once again unattractive in the eyes of the seller, because the buyers don't care whether it's a profit or loss, right? So here what will happen is some existing sellers will leave. It's an unattractive market. And once again, as existing sellers leave with no change in the number of buyers, then the ones who stay back, they get a larger number of buyers. Yes? So that means whether it's a situation of profit or loss to start with, eventually the market will move to the break-even point in perfect competition, and that happens because of that free entry and exit of sellers. So that means this is the most stable point in perfect competition. Once you reach this point, there are very less chances that the buyers and sellers will move from this point, the market will move from this point. And please note that this output at this point, this output is produced at the minimum most cost, right? So it is called the cost minimizing output. We talked about that. We said when you produce at the minimum point of ATC, that particular level of output is called the minimum cost minimizing output, because you are producing it at the minimum most cost. Is that clear? Okay. So in that sense, that is the reason that we called perfect competition most perfect or efficient, because always, no matter what, whether there is profit or loss to begin with, the market always breaks even eventually, right? And then finally, they will settle down, all the sellers will settle down for producing a quantity, and the buyers will settle down for buying a quantity which is the cost minimizing quantity. Okay, so in that sense it is efficient. So if I ask you why is perfect competition efficient, your answer is this, whatever I said, that no matter whether there is profit or loss, this market always moves towards break even, and as soon as it moves towards break even, it's always going to produce the cost minimizing level of output. Anyways, moving on. So coming back, that over the long run, people will be producing the cost minimizing level of output. Okay, is that clear? So in perfect competition, that is all you have to know, that whether there is profit or loss in the market will eventually move towards break even, and when the market moves towards break even, then the market produces the cost minimizing level of output. If the market produces the cost minimizing level of output, that is why we call this the most efficient market structure, because it is able to fulfill the objective, because you know objective of any seller, objective of any market should be cost minimization. Now coming to monopoly, the features of the monopoly market, the most important feature is that there is a single seller. That is what monopoly means. There is one single seller, okay? But there may be large number of buyers, but usually this large number is a finite number. It is not infinite. Okay? So it's a finite number of buyers. Third one is homogeneous product, because there is only one person making the product and one person selling that product. So obviously the question of differentiated product does not arise here. Difference only stays if there are more than one seller, right? So there is only one seller selling it, so it is one homogeneous product that he is selling to everybody, correct? And the fourth one is barriers to entry and exit. In this case, there is one single seller who is ruling that entire market. So obviously, if some new seller wants to come in, this existing monopolist will try with all his force to stop him from coming in, because he does not want to share the market with anybody, and he himself does not want to get out of that market, because he wants to remain the king of the market forever. Right? So there it is not easy for new guys to come into the market, and it is not so easy for that existing single seller to just get out of the market. He will try to be in the market for as long as he can, and he will try to prevent others from coming into the market for as long as he can. That is usually what we call monopoly behavior. In any market across the world, monopolists always behave like that. Okay? Some examples of monopoly in the real world would be public utilities. For example, in Springfield, you have Springfield City Utilities, right? Public utility companies are monopolists. Public transport sometimes is monopoly. For example, in USA passenger railways, Amtrak, right? You may have smaller railway transit in cities, but USA wide it's Amtrak, right? In many other countries, you have monopoly. For example, you know, till some time in the search engine market, Google was a monopoly. Now you have other search engines like Bing and all, which is giving competition. But also in the operating systems market, you know, there was monopoly for some time, right? So you do have monopolists in the real world, and that is the feature of a monopoly. Now, like I said, why do we need to study about monopoly? We need to study about monopoly because all these healthcare industries in the healthcare field that you have, they are not monopolists, they are monopolistic competition, but they always try to become a monopoly. They try to rule the market, they try to become the single one in the market so that they can get the maximum share of the market. They try to kick out the competitors and become a monopolist. Okay? So that's why we need to know what do we mean by a monopoly. Now, before that, just I want to digress a little bit and show you one thing and make sure you understand that. Okay. Now, here I have some commodity and I have the quantity and the price of that commodity, right. This looks consistent because as the price of the commodity is going down, the quantity demanded for the commodity is going up. So, that is consistent with law of demand. You know that is what law of demand tells you. As the price of a good decreases, people want to buy more of the good. So, that is consistent, correct. Law of demand holds. So, if I try to draw a graph between this P and Q, what curve will that give me? If I plot P on the y axis and Q on the x axis, what curve will I get? What curve, what is it called? Downward sloping. What is the name of that curve? Demand curve. So, basically if you plot this relationship, what you get is your D curve, correct, and that will be downward sloping because the law of demand holds, right. Now, if I want to get total revenue from here, total revenue will be price times quantity, correct. So, this will be 10, 18, 24, 28, correct. Now, if I try to get the marginal revenue, then marginal revenue will be 18 minus 10, 2. That means for every extra one I am finding, 24 minus 18, that is, how much is that? 6, right. 28 minus 24, that is 4. 30 minus 28, that is true. Okay. So, law of diminishing marginal revenue is also true. The marginal revenue is also going down. Yes?
Oh, 8. 18 minus 10. 18 minus 10. Should be 8.
Sorry. The marginal revenue is also going down. So, law of diminishing marginal revenue also holds, correct here. So, if I had to plot this marginal revenue curve, this will also be downward sloping. Do you agree? And this demand curve, like Brad said, this will also be downward sloping. Okay. Now, let us say I have this diagram where I am plotting quantity on the x axis. So, the quantity is this, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I am trying to plot price here, right, then for this will be 10, 9, 6, correct. And if I join those points, what I am going to get is the demand curve. Will you agree? And similarly, if I still had the quantity on the x axis, but I was plotting the marginal revenue on the y axis, I was plotting this marginal revenue here, then the marginal revenue for the first unit, marginal revenue is kind of 0. For the second unit, it is 8. Okay. So, for the second unit, it will be somewhere here, sorry, here. For the third unit, it will be here. For the fourth unit, it will be at 4, so it will be even lower. And for the fifth unit, it will be even lower, somewhere at 2, right. So, if I join those points, then I would get that downward sloping marginal revenue curve, correct. So, what I am trying to kind of tell you is that if the law of demand holds and if the law of diminishing marginal revenue holds, then always both these curves will be downward sloping, but the marginal revenue curve will always be below the demand curve. Can you please write that down? If law of demand holds and law of diminishing marginal revenue holds, if law of demand holds and law of diminishing marginal revenue holds, then both demand curve and marginal revenue curve, then both demand curve and marginal revenue curve will be downward sloping, but the marginal revenue curve will lie below the demand curve. That will always be true no matter what numbers you take. If those two laws are holding, then the marginal revenue curve will always be located below the demand curve. Okay? So, in monopoly, given the structure of the market, in monopoly both these laws hold. The monopolist follows, in a monopoly market there is law of diminishing marginal revenue and there is law of demand that holds in a monopoly market. So, that means in a monopoly market, now if I want to draw the diagram for a monopoly market, you have exactly that same diagram that I just drew on the board. You have quantity, and if I measure marginal revenue here, then I have a marginal revenue curve and I have a demand curve, but that demand curve and the marginal revenue curve are both downward sloping, but MR is always going to lie below the D curve, okay, in case of a monopolist. Okay. Now, let's say this is my, now in this market let us say I am also measuring my ATC and my MC here. Now, I am bringing in the cost into this market because obviously every seller has a cost of production. Now, once again, just like perfect competition, now this guy is not a price taker, right? He is the single seller, so he has complete market power. He can decide at what price he will sell and the buyers have no other option but to buy from him. So, this monopolist, please write down, the monopolist is not a price taker, rather he is a price maker. He has complete control on whatever price he wants to sell that good for. So, let us say this is the MC curve for the monopolist. Okay. And this point that you have right here, that is MR is equal to MC, what is that point actually? That is your marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost point, right? Because revenue is the benefit of the producer. Remember, profit, revenue, utility, these are all benefits. Cost is of course the cost, right? So, here that is basically, this is your MR is equal to MC point on this diagram, which is your marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost point, isn't it? And this monopolist, like every other seller, they will take their decision based on MR is equal to MC. Even if you turn back, look at your perfect competition diagram, just turn a page back, look at that break even point. Even at that break even point that you had, the marginal revenue was equal to the marginal cost, isn't it? At that break even point, that horizontal marginal revenue that was equal to that upward rising marginal cost at that break even point. So, that means every seller wants to produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, in other words wherever marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost, correct? Now, at this point, how do I know the price? From where, how do I get the price from this point? How do you know the price? From which curve do you read the price? From which of these curves can you read the price? When we had that table on the board, how was I getting the price? For every quantity I had a price and then I was plotting a curve. Which curve is that? The demand curve, right? So, if the monopolist is producing at this point, then obviously this is his quantity because you are measuring quantity on the horizontal axis, but please note that this is not his price. This is his point of production, but his price has to be read from the demand curve, because the demand curve is the curve that gives you the relationship between price and quantity. So, he produces that quantity at this particular price. Do you agree? So, we get his point of production from MR is equal to MC, but we have to read his price from his demand curve. So, he produces Q star and he sells it for the price P star. But so far we do not know anything about his cost of production because we do not see the ATC curve here, correct? We do not see the ATC curve here. Once again, there can be three possibilities for a monopolist. Just like the perfect competition, the ATC curve can lie above the demand curve. It can look like this. So, it can be in a situation like that. Okay. It can be like ATC2 where it is exactly touching the demand curve at that point, okay. Or it can be like ATC3 where it is lying between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. Once again reminding you that all three are not possible at the same time. A monopolist may have a cost of production that is extremely high like ATC1, it may be moderate like ATC2, or it can be low like ATC3. Okay. So, these are three different situations that are possible. Okay. Please note once again that this is still the production point, right? The MR is equal to MC. So, that is the quantity, that is the price. Now, let us assume that this monopolist has the cost of production ATC1, right? Then to produce this quantity Q star, he is selling it for P star, but his cost of production is this, isn't it? C1 star. Do you agree? I am reading it from ATC1. To produce Q star, he is incurring a cost of C1 star, reading it from the first cost curve. If that is the relevant cost curve, then that is the price, but that is the cost, isn't it? So, can I say that C1 star is greater than P star? Yes? If that is true, is the monopolist going to make profit or loss? If his cost of production is greater than the price that he gets, is it profit or loss? Loss, right? So, then write down if the ATC is above the demand curve, then monopolist makes a loss. Look at situation 3. There you still have that same quantity, but now your cost is that, right? Still that is the quantity, but that, what is wrong with these pens? Just need to throw these away. So, that is still the quantity, but now that is the cost. I am reading it from ATC3, correct? So, the cost would have been C3. The price would still have been P star if he was producing Q star, because it is the same demand curve. But if his ATC is lower, then his C3 is lower than that market price. So, is this situation of profit or loss? Profit. So, please write down that if the ATC curve is between the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve or anywhere lower than that, then they are going to make a profit. And we are left with the second situation, that is ATC2. Please note that once again the quantity is the same, but now the cost is exactly the same as that price, isn't it? The price is the same as that C2 star. I am reading from ATC2, the curve ATC2. That is exactly tangent to the demand curve. So, in situation 3, C2 star is exactly equal to P star. So, that means there is 0 profit, 0 loss, which is break even. Do you agree? Right? There is no profit, no loss. Now, once again reiterating that all these are not possible at the same time. You can either have a monopolist who makes profit. He will make profit if his ATC curve looks like ATC 3, that is between the demand curve and marginal revenue curve. He will make a loss if his ATC is like ATC 1, lying above the demand curve, and he will break even if it is something like ATC 2, where his cost is exactly equal to P star, right. Now, once again, just like perfect competition, if he is at ATC 3, then this market is extremely attractive market, right. So, new people will want to come into the market, but now you have strong barriers to entry. So, can new people come in? No, right. Similarly, if this guy is at ATC 1, then this is an unattractive market. So, this person will want to leave the market, right, but will he leave immediately? He won't. He will try to come back from that loss into profit or breaking even. So, that means what are we getting? We are getting that in the monopolist, adjustment does not take place easily. So, if a person starts making profit, he makes profit for a long period of time, because there is nobody to come in and eat away that profit. If he makes a loss, then it takes time for him to recover from that loss. And if he breaks even, then he keeps breaking even for a long period of time. So, what we are saying is that in a monopolist, whatever happens in the short run, that continues over a long period of time, because you do not have adjustment through free entry and exit of seller. So, it is a sustainable outcome. In perfect competition, profit and loss were temporary, break even was permanent. In case of monopoly, whatever be the outcome, that is sort of permanent and not temporary. One last point before I end today's class. Now, please note that this output, none of this is at the minimum point of those respective ATCs, right. None of them are at the minimum point of the ATCs. The minimum point of this ATC would have been here, this would have been there, this should have been there. It is lower than the minimum point of ATC, isn't it? So, they are not producing the cost minimizing level of output. Do you see that? So, please write down, a monopolist does not produce the cost minimizing level of output. The monopolist does not produce a cost minimizing level of output. Okay. You understood why it is not cost minimizing? Because none of this Q star is not at the minimum point of these ATCs. The minimum point of this ATC would have been here, for this it would have been there, for that one that would have been there, where the MC cuts through, right, correct. Now, had this been perfect competition, then where would I have the price? I would have it here at that minimum price. It would have been MR is equal to P bar. For this one, it would have been here at that minimum point. For this one, it would have been there, isn't it? Correct? So, for perfect competition, I would have quantities that are higher, correct? The cost minimizing quantity, but the price, please note, would have been lower in that case. In that case, it would have been lower. So, that means in perfect competition, it is possible to produce a higher quantity yet charge a lower price than monopoly, and that is why the monopoly is inefficient than perfect competition. Last, what is the last point you wrote? A monopolist does not produce the cost minimizing output, right? And this quantity produced by the monopolist is less than the quantity produced by perfect competition but sold at a higher price than perfect competition. Of course, we are comparing between the two. So, the idea is that the monopolist sells a lower level of output, but at a higher level of price. So, in that sense the monopolist is inefficient. Perfect competition produces cost minimizing output and is able to sell it at a low price. Monopolist is not able to do that. Okay? So, we will stop here today.